Good afternoon and welcome to today's Industry Week webcast, Supply Chain Visibility, a New Look, sponsored by Software AG. My name is Adrienne Selko, Senior Editor with Industry Week. Before we begin, let me explain how you can participate in today's presentation. If at any time you are having audio difficulties or slides are not advancing, simply hit the F5 key to refresh your webcast console. If you have any technical difficulties during today's sessions, please press the Help button to receive assistance in solving common issues. This webinar technology allows you to resize the presentation by clicking the Maximize icon or by dragging the lower right corner to enlarge the window. We welcome your questions during today's event. In order to submit a question, simply type it into the question window on the left side of your screen and hit the Submit button. We'll be answering as many questions as possible during the Q&A session that will follow the main presentation, but feel free to go ahead and send your questions at any time. Please also be aware today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Industry Week website within the next week for you to review. You'll be notified by email when the archive is available. On your console, the Software AG logo is hot linked. If you want to visit their website during this webcast, you can click on a logo and a new window will open. It will not take you out of the webinar. I'd like to welcome today's speakers. We have with us Sean Riley, who is a Global Industry Director for Manufacturing and Transportation for Software AG. Over the past 6 years, Sean has been focused on enterprise digital transformation with a focus on leveraging technologies like IoT, predictive and analytics, machine learning, and intelligent automation as applied to production, field services, supply chains, logistics, and new product development. We also have with us Eric Argueta, who is Vice President of Global Enterprise Solutions at Visual Enterprise Architecture. Over the past 15 years, Eric has helped numerous clients foster innovation and effectively bridge the gap between business and IT to provide successful results in global business transformation initiatives. I'd like to turn the call over to Sean.
Thank you, Adrienne. Appreciate the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. We hope you find the webinar to be both fun and enjoyable. To start off with, we'd just like to say a quick piece about Software AG and our partner, Visual Enterprise Architects. At Software AG, our vision is driven by customer needs, backed by both proven technology and heritage around in-depth process and industry expertise. We have the experience to ensure customer success because more than 70% of the Global 1000 and Gartner Top 25 supply chains are Software AG customers. We have a service-oriented culture with 4,400 team members around the world, with a size of about 1 billion euros annually in turnover, which receive feedback that we're a good-sized company for a lot of organizations. And we've been helping organizations become digital enterprises for years. In regards to our place in the industry, rather than focusing on a single industry segment, Software AG has been multi-domain for its almost 50 years in existence. And we're going to leverage one of our customers to help understand why we're here today, what the point of our webinar is, and what we hope everyone can gain and learn from it. And this focused on this particular company is a consumer products and healthcare company. And they wanted to ensure that they were able to improve their operations while fundamentally transforming their company. The issue was they had faced 10 years of stagnant growth. They were continuously entering into the market late because of complexities, both in addressing their market needs and the huge amount of bureaucracy that had encompassed this particular company. They had over 72 different go-to-market models that they were operating under with supply chains to support each of those various go-to-market models. In short, they were a very large company that was unable to properly leverage their scale. And they were being beaten to the marketplace by smaller, nimbler competitors. So they had to understand exactly what they needed to do to be able to get a grip and manage their complex global supply chains that span from traditional existing markets in established leading parts of the world to their desire to enter into emerging markets and not only enter into it in a piecemeal process, but enter into those emerging markets as a dominant leader in that particular area. Furthermore, as they were looking at this particular issue, they noticed that part of their culture was they weren't necessarily action-oriented because they didn't have clear details on what was occurring throughout their supply chain. They had a focus on blaming people and not the problem, which seems to be a typical symptom for many companies that look at or lack the ability to pinpoint a particular issue, lack the proper amount of visibility throughout their extended supply chain. It's easy to turn to a person. It's easy to turn to a typical role. It's easy to turn to a typical department and lay blame for a failure at their particular feet. So what they sought to do was really look at how can we become more customer-centric while realizing increasingly more difficult to hit operational hurdles. And to do that, we need to understand that we have the ability to understand what's happening in our end-to-end supply chain from an operational perspective, from a tactical perspective, to be able to use that information to model how we want our entire supply chain to operate in the future as well, and ensure we're able to automate the ability to comply with changing regulatory requirements around the globe. And incidentally, we need to do this quickly because, like so many other mandates, the executives laid out a plan for transformation and said it's all going to be done yesterday. So for this particular company, with their transformation, they were able to realize a 25% increase in profit while increasing on time in full and significantly decreasing their held inventory. And that was because they were able to identify what are our fastest methods to go to market, to support that market. How do we optimize our supply chains to functionally work on a day-to-day basis from all the tactical issues, as well as take that information and optimize our supply chains on a strategic basis. And most importantly, they were able to have a single unified structure that provided them with visibility into not only the outcomes of my supply chain endeavors. So what's my on time and full? What's my held inventory rate on a location? How am I doing in terms of my forecast accuracy? How am I doing in terms of being able to meet my forecasted demand? But also visibility into how all those actions were occurring. And that allowed them to, again, unify those actions and ensure that those 82 different value chain models were rationalized and simplified down to less than 6. And that gave them the scale that they needed, that gave them the simplification, that gave them the ability to operate in a heterogeneous environment in a very unified and straightforward manner. So how did they go about doing this? Well, they looked at, from a visibility perspective, first off, understanding how do I take my strategy and really tie it into my business capabilities. And that's something that they focused on. If we don't have the ability to make that link from a supply chain functionality, from an overall business functionality perspective, then we won't be able to properly manage and measure regardless of the amount of visibility we obtain into our supply chain. Secondly, they ensured that they were able to implement their end-to-end supply chain processes in a manual and automated manner where the two actions met each other, because they have ideas of also going to a autonomously operated supply chain where users are creating selection criteria for the future and not having to react to every unplanned event on a daily basis, not having to operate inside of those supply chain parameters, and freeing up their people for more strategic work rather than firefighting. And then during that execution phase, how do I understand, control, and optimize exactly what I'm doing? And it's that controlling and understanding portion that looks at not only what are the outcomes on a continuous basis, but also how can I take that information of how my supply chain fundamentally executed on an end-to-end basis with every step in between, and then simulate possible modifications to that supply chain. If I wanted to have additional inventory in this location, if I wanted to reduce held inventory in another, or if I wanted to change the way I functionally operate inside of a warehouse with the processes that they use, what's that going to have on these outcomes before I begin implementing them? And there's a very good reason why they were pursuing that. And that's because while this was one of their critical initiatives that was being pursued, like many companies, there's these wonderful other technologies that come into play. And that's part of the people, processes, and technology triangle that drives our supply chains today. The first being, how do I understand what's happening in my multiple systems of supply chain execution? And that requires them to be brought together and ensure that information is shared across them for transformation, which is where I want to understand is that information is moving. What does that information mean? And do I have an underlying issue of the information is not being shared as it should be, or do I have an underlying execution issue? Secondly, when I want to look at how I am bringing in new analytics, and descriptive and diagnostic analytics are typically the mainstay of most organizations today, with the ability to look at some real-time and some predictive analytics throughout portions of the supply chain. But as I'm using those particular capabilities, how can I fundamentally maximize the value of those capabilities to transform my supply chain? And how can I see and understand the true value that those new capabilities are giving me? And more importantly, how can I then not just modify the way I operate, but really optimize my entire end-to-end supply chain functionality for what for the support that these new capabilities are giving me. And then lastly, as I'm moving towards the last execution area, how can I look at my autonomously running supply chain where actions are being taken post my predictive analytics, or the buzz term for that is AI in the supply chain? How can I have visibility to what's being done previously, to what's changing, to what's going to happen? And as I'm moving in that direction, and as I'm gaining that particular visibility, how can I ensure that again, all of the actions that I'm taking on a day-to-day basis are focused on that key aspect that we talked about earlier, strategy being supported by my everyday KPI performance so that the business moves in the right direction and that my supply chain functionality is supporting the company objectives as a whole. My colleague Eric Argueta from Visual Enterprise Architects is now going to give us a quick demonstration on how these capabilities work and what they mean for us today as supply chain practitioners and what they can potentially do for us in the future. So, Eric?
Thank you, Sean. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to demonstrate to you a little bit of the some of the capabilities that our process intelligence tool has and how we can incorporate that into our what do I do today, what do I do right now to help move my supply chain along. So this demo is based on a car company that has multiple dealership locations across the world and has multiple assembly locations across the world and how they affect each other. And we'll see how we can utilize visualization to understand what is going on in our supply chain. So one of the main components of understanding process intelligence is presentation. So more than likely, within each of our organizations, we have several stakeholders that have different needs, different focuses within each of our organizations. So, for example, in this particular example, we have the globe, right? We're looking at different regions, and you'll notice that each of those regions has a set of traffic lights. Green for good, yellow for we're approaching thresholds, and red there's a problem within my supply chain or my processes. So these could be an aggregate of KPIs that you defined. For example, you can say I want to be able to make sure that if an order is late and a supplier is late, to aggregate it up to give me a red light, for example. If only one of them is failing, for example, then it's a yellow that is approaching the threshold, or green when both of them are okay. So this is one of the ways that we can present the information. Now, the same information can be presented in a different way. For example, using a process view of the organization. So we can have a regional view of the organization. This is a process view of the organization, and this is based mainly on the core processes on the SCORE model, right? Plan, source, make, deliver, return. And so we see here that the deliver side of the house is the one that is having the issue as well. So from that perspective is that we can certainly start looking into drilling down where some of the issues are occurring. Now, a third view of an entry model, for example, could be a management console when you're looking at several different areas of the organization. Perhaps you're looking at a specific product. You're looking at a specific region. You're looking at a specific distribution center, for example. So whatever the information that you're concentrating on, you can certainly project it in a way that makes sense to your shareholder. And this, for example, could be your product manager that is looking at the information and saying, my low-to performance is only 44%. Here are my late deliveries, and here are my total deliveries as a percent, in dollars. So right away, I can start looking into where in my organization do I need to concentrate on. So, for example, in this case, I'm seeing that it's my values in here are below my threshold, so I gotta start acting on it. So the next, so I quickly dive into it and I start looking into, okay, so what's the actionable intelligence that I can use to start gauging where some of my issues are occurring. So, for example, in this case, I'm looking at an aggregate of a whole year, and I can break it down by, say, quarter, but in this case, I'm going to look at it for the entire year. And I can see that San Francisco, for my order changes, is having a real issue in here. And not only that, but we can see here that the order duration is also approaching that threshold. Now, one of the overall ideas is that you want to get as much information as possible, as quickly as possible, in the hands of the people who are going to be the decision makers. So in this case, we're just trying to provide some information in terms of saying what are some of the orders that we're having issues with, what are some of the process costs as well, and the average throughput time, so we can serve different parameters based on the information. So if I start looking at different quarters, for example, in this manner, I can see that the KPIs are reversed in this case, right? The order duration is more is an issue with San Francisco, versus the order changes are not as severe in Q1. So we want to start understanding what happened in Q1 versus the entire year that's given me this result. And I can step through each of the quarters to start looking at a time-based analysis to understand what's going on in each of the quarters that is giving me those numbers, right? So, for example, in Q4, we can see that everything is green. And at the same time, we're not looking at only one dimension, meaning, for example, usually when we look at a KPI, we need to talk about, say, for example, not only how late are the orders, but what's the volume or the cost of the orders. In some instances, we want to treat every order that is the same, for example, have the same weight. But unfortunately, let's just say an order that's late, that's worth $10 million, you might want to treat it differently than an order that's late, that's worth $10. So in that essence, you want to look at every aspect of your supply chain, not only concentrate on your predetermined views of your information. So in this case, we're looking at, for example, at a dealer, at a production location, and an assembly location also to make sure that you get a clean, accurate picture of your entire supply chain. So drilling down a little bit harder into that, then we see process variance. And these variations that we get from a process are extracted from your specific execution. So now we're looking at what you're actually physically doing in the plants. So in this case, in here, we see the process variance, and the number that you see to the right-hand side is the number of times that this process was executed. And at the same time here, the number all the way at the right-hand side is what is the process cycle time. So this variation of our process, which is the most common variation of our process, took 77 days to execute. The second most common view of the information, the variation, took 72 days to execute. So what's the difference between these two variations that perhaps shaved 5 days from the total cycle time? So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select the first one, and you can see that you miss a complete branch once you're looking at this specific variation. Now, let me take a look at the second variation. I go back to my variation, and I go, okay, so what is the second variation? What's the change behind it? And we can see here that not only a branch or rework is not being followed, but at the same time, there was one step over here, which is the create quotation step, that is no longer required. So just from understanding the variation in the way that you're executing processes, you can see that the create quotation process adds 5 cycle days to your time. So that's a tremendous amount of time that you're skewing by performing one individual step. Now you can start looking at more steps. For example, the third most common variation of your process, and then you can start doing that analysis. Now, the interesting thing about the third most common one is that it always goes through change. So then you can start seeing that not only that, but changes add a tremendous amount of time to your cycle time at the same time. Okay. Now, variations from a overall perspective can mean a number of different things, but perhaps you even want to start drilling a little bit lower into what's causing a variation. So you have the ability to even filter each of these variations, for example, by assembly location, or perhaps it was the color that perhaps the red paint that you're using in one of your models is delayed, for example, and that's causing a specific issue. Perhaps the custom equipment, like the sports package that you're going to put in one of the cars, is giving you an issue. So, for example, I'm just going to select both, and then in this case, you can start seeing that if I select blue in here, how my process cycle times are going to change. Let me select the champagne color, for example, and then you can start seeing how those variations are starting to change, and the cycle time also changes for some of those variations. When I start thinking about perhaps the sport package, and I'm only concentrating on the sports package, then it gives me different variations. So I can combine a multi-dimensional variable approach to my analysis to understand what is really the root cause of some of my issues. Now, in addition to that, I can start looking into, okay, I see the processes, but what are some of the contributors for the processes at the step level? What are some of the specific steps that are causing the most trouble? We saw that create quotation added an average of 5 days to our cycle time. So what we want to start doing is we want to start saying, okay, so when I look at create quotation by itself, for example, what is the processing time in hours? And I can start slicing and dicing the information by perhaps by Q1. We noticed that Q4 was a good quarter for us. So what we can start doing is that we can start learning from what was being done in Q4 that was not being done in Q1 or in the entire year that was adding additional complexity to our process. So you can start selecting, for example, additional information in here from, let's say, a dealer location in Philadelphia. We see that the cycle time for that specific step is 3.6 days. When we go to San Francisco, it's 3.4 days, for example, and then we can start varying the information to understand where is the biggest contributor to the cycle time. And as you can see here, for example, change customer order is really the biggest contributor to time in here. So anytime that we follow this branch to change customer order, that's when we start adding more and more time to our cycle time. Okay. In addition to that, the tool will even alert you when there is, for example, when you're not doing things right or not according to plan. So this is not design. We haven't even gotten there yet, but this is the execution of the engine in terms of telling you what is going on and where you need to look. So for example, in this case, it gives you, this is the incorrect order or the unexpected process start. So from a conformance perspective, it can start triggering you to say, hey, by the way, you know what? This, you can't final assembly until you paint it, for example. So in this case, it's trying to either your supply chain or your system, or there's some training issues that you're trying to resolve. So what you're trying to understand is that where is my conformance rate? And then you can start and how can I not only use the most efficient process from a variation perspective, the shortest one that I have, but at the same time, the one that's conforming the best to my expectation. Now, on the opposite end as well, just because you're following each of the steps that you said that you were going to follow, or in the sequence that you're following them, doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the most efficient process, for example. So in this case, we're just going to look at specific variations in here to look at the process conformance rates. This second variation, or the combination of both, you can start seeing that you have unexpected process starts over here. When you remove the create quotation, because you can make it into a business rule, for example, that every process or every order must start with a quotation. So the process that you thought was being efficient is really not being conforming with your design, because it's really not following your overall process. Okay? At the same time, you can do comparisons between two processes. So for example, let's just say if I'm going to select San Francisco in here, I'm going to see that my process duration and cycle time is 89.6 days. Now, let me select San Francisco at the same time also in here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to vary my assembly location. And by varying my assembly location from Shanghai in one to, let's say, Barcelona in the second one, we can see that there's a difference so perhaps it's not my dealer. Perhaps it's my assembly location. Perhaps it's, let me take a look at another assembly location. And apparently, San Francisco with Pretoria is the most efficient way, but San Francisco with Shanghai is the least efficient way to actually execute this process. Now, when I look at the longest lasting variation of my process, I'm going to remove each of the selections, and I'm going to see that, for example, when I look at each of these, you see that my most severe length of the process time was 199.5 days. That is more than double my most efficient time with, for example, with San Francisco and Pretoria. And so in that case, I have to start acting that perhaps there's a specific issue with an assembly plant, with a dealer, the combination of the two, and not only that, but I mean, now when you have to even factor in global economic aspects like tariffs and everything else, then you can start looking into the impact to your supply chain, and perhaps you want to shift inventory from one location to another, or shift some of your capacity to it. At the same time, for example, it can serve you as a simulator in terms of your process. So let's just say in here, let's just say here's again looking at your variations. Here you discover process flows. You can see all of the different back and forth and reworks in your process. But let's just say keeping the same labor cost per hour the same. And then let's just say that if you reduce the time per change from 5 minutes to 4 minutes, all of a sudden we're getting a 500 euro savings in your execution. So that right there you can provide immediate feedback to some of your stakeholders that what are some of the important components behind it as well. Now, at the same time, you can start combining additional capabilities. For example, in this case, it's just a more involved assembly line where you can start saying, okay, the finished process instances, how many of them were sold, what are the production faults, and whether that's a good number or a bad number, how is your production over time, average material costs, et cetera, and some of the revenue. Now, so once you start looking into saying, okay, so I understand now that, for example, I got to deal with maybe San Francisco and something to do with Pretoria, let's say in my improvement. So one of the things that I do is I'm going back to this page, right? You start saying, okay, so where do I have to improve? And so you start looking into which of your processes and how does process intelligence pinpoint the ability to know where you need to start acting once you start thinking about process improvements. So in this case, we look at deliver, right? And this is where we start looking into design. For those of you familiar with the ARIS platform, this is the design module behind for software AG. So what this does is that it allows you to model all of the business processes and design all the business processes within your organization. You can use different frameworks, APQC, SCORE, a number of different perspectives. But this is just a sample value chain of where your issues are occurring. So in this case, we look at the tool already marked this as this is a big issue, for example. And so what you're going to do is you can look directly into the process. And this is where the design, the as executed and as designed converge. This is on the left, you're going to see what you think that you're doing. And on the right, you're going to start seeing what you're actually physically doing. Remember, you're not only looking at one variation of a process, right? So, for example, when you're implementing your system, this process could be perhaps 2 years old. And then by the time you actually went through the modifications, implementing your system, whether it's SAP, Oracle, or Ariba, or some other system, there might be a huge time lag between your design to your execution. So what this is doing is that it's presenting you both in the same screen to say, hey, by the way, you're training against, this is in your SOP, for example, but how people are executing it is very, very different. So here, for example, we're going to start looking into the process discovery. And here is the issue in terms of this is your as designed on the left, and this is your as executed. And so what ARIS can do is can tell you, okay, so how conforming have you been through the last 4 quarters, for example, and you can see that you're going from 75 to 89 in terms of conformance, where you're still below the threshold of 90%. But more importantly, it's going to tell you, by the way, we discovered some activities that are not represented in your design, and vice versa at the same time. We discovered some activities in the model that are not being executed. So, for example, one of the things that occurs is that which one are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the process that you're executing, or the process that you designed when you're going through process improvements? So one of the things that you want to do is that you want to reduce the gap from the design to the execution, and this is the only tool in the market that actually does both. That it can portray both the design engine on the left and the detailed process on the right. Okay. And so once you start doing that again, you get into your process improvement loop, and you start monitoring once you make those changes, you release them to production, you go back on the wheel, and you start saying, okay, so I made a change. Let's measure the impact of that change and see how that's going on in my supply chain. With that, I'll send it back to Sean.
Great, thanks, Eric. I appreciated the overview as always. So, just to begin wrapping up, and before we go into questions, Software AG has been a leader in its technology fields, as recognized by leading analysts like Forrester, Gartner, and mock nation across all of the pieces of technology that we provide to enterprises. Additionally, if you are interested in learning more about this, feel free to download an asset. Ask us to provide a custom demonstration of what Eric has just provided to you, or feel free to reach out to either myself or Eric directly. With that being said, Adrian, back to you for any questions that we might have picked up.
Okay, great. Thank you. The first question I'll ask to Eric: how does this support both optimizing supply chains and transforming them?
I'll leave that up to Sean and for that one from a strategic perspective.
Sure. So this product supports optimization and transformation through, number one, being able to understand in an automated fashion how your supply chains are operating on a daily basis, regionally, globally, or on a SKU or customer basis, by giving you both the outcomes of how am I performing with my KPIs, as well as the methodologies. What did I do to obtain those particular KPIs? What specific actions did I take? With that, you can always tweak and correct those particular actions to ensure that any of those particular nodes in the supply chain or the supply chain as a whole is operating as you want in the best fashion in its current state. From a transformation perspective, and this is where the power of the visibility, it's really interesting, is you can take that information of how my supply chain processes were executed, specifically what were the actual results of those executed processes, and then layer on new pieces of functionality, such as what would happen if I had a bot making decisions for me, or what would happen if decisions about what mode of transportation to use or switch to was made automatically based on changing market conditions, and be able to truly transform how your supply chain fundamentally operates, or such as, hey, I want to participate on a private blockchain. I don't want to have to have a process that supports a manual paper exchange with government entities or with import-export banks, and I'm going to be now being paid and operating under a smart contract system. What can I do to transform my supply chain to take full advantage of those new capabilities? That's where, again, you can take your current processes as being executed and understand what it's going to be like in the future by simulating those particular changes and understanding how that's going to impact your key performance indicators. So that's how this would particularly both transform and optimize an existing supply chain.
Okay, great. Thanks. Eric, this one I think is for you. What is the process used to enter all the data that creates these dashboards, and how are they kept up to date?
Great question. So what we usually do, we have two distinct approaches. If you have an SAP environment, we have connectors that deploy directly on your SAP environment and perform the data extraction. And what they do is that the mining of processes is really based on event logs. So, for example, when let's just say you have an order with 10 items, and 3 items shipped today, 7 items shipped tomorrow. You wanna say that your completed order took X number of days, but at the same time you want to track each of those line items. So in order for us to do that, we connect directly to your SAP system, and we have templates that link the tables together and produce these dashboards already for you. So these are out of the box functionality. Now, let's just say that you have an Oracle system, you have an SAP system, you have Salesforce, you have a bunch of Excel things, etc. We can also link those together, and what we do is that we put them on a schedule. And what they do is, whether you're using the SAP connector or whether you're using the manual quote unquote connections between different systems, we put them on a schedule. And let's just say that you're going to analyze last quarter, last year. I only want to analyze this product, etc. So what the tool will do is that depending on the parameters that you set, it will continue to extract this information based on the templates that generate the dashboards, as we discussed, and that keeps the information up to date. And that could be done on a hourly basis, on a daily basis. Most of our customers do it overnight, but so every morning you come with an actionable. You come with a screen that basically gives you red, yellow, green to see where you need to go and look.
Okay, great. This next question is for Sean. How do the consumer products and healthcare leader know where to get started?
Yeah, that's also a very good question, because taking the first step can typically be the hardest, especially when you want it to be the highest impact. In this instance, the company was able to understand in an automated fashion how their supply chain processes were operating. So in obtaining that data from their numerous systems of record and having that supply chain process built for them, they were able to identify the areas that caused the largest bottlenecks or cost increases in their supply chain. Consequently, they were able to focus not on forecasting, but actually on warehouse fulfillment and execution, as those particular areas lended themselves to constantly causing SLAs to be violated or missed. And then from there, moving back to the customer service and order functions, as those were the second largest areas of trouble. But the end result was, again, they were able to automatically identify where they needed to start and to do so with data quickly without having to, for lack of a better term, pull the audience, i.e. reach out to everyone and their brother to think where the largest bang for your buck might reside.
Okay, thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to thank our speakers, Sean Riley and Eric Argueta, and our sponsor, Software AG. On behalf of Industry Week, have a productive remainder of the day.